Patient care often boils down to the quality of care, which of course can be influenced by the speed of care. Something that remote access can help with materially by enhancing operational efficiency and enabling innovations in healthcare. Welcome to this second episode of RealVNC's Remote Access Redefined podcast series. Today we're going to be exploring how remote access integration is transforming the medical field, looking at some interesting healthcare use cases, including cardiac device monitoring, a company doing AI-powered scanning of patient data, and specific application of remote access in eye clinics. I'm your host, Nick Cavalancia from Conversational Geek, and joining me today is Dom Parks, lead developer for OEM at RealVNC. Dom, thanks once again for joining me.
Hi, Nick. Yeah, good to be here.
Glad you're here. Now, Dom, in our first episode together, you gave the listening audience sort of a deep dive introduction about yourself and your role at RealVNC. But would you give those who missed that maybe the succinct version for this podcast episode?
Yeah, I think it could be as short as almost just the job title. So, I'm lead engineer OEM, and that means I look after the technical side of SDK, OEM, any kind of customer integrations with RealVNC solutions.
Awesome. That sounds perfect here. So could we start by maybe having you give the listening audience here an overview of the ways in which remote access is helping organizations in the healthcare industry specifically to improve their products, to allow them to innovate, and so on?
Yeah, sure, Nick. I think some of this is the generic remote access benefits, and they apply to almost any industry. So there's things like the tech support, you're reducing truck rolls or reducing on-site visits, and that's pretty widespread, pretty universal. And maybe you've got some other things that are similar to that, like the kind of integration and monitoring use cases that you could probably imagine would work inside a healthcare setting or not. But I think for healthcare, there are some very specific ways in which remote access can help and can improve things. And some of those are actually really recent things that have come about as a result of COVID. That's kind of accelerated the move into remote access, just separating patients from doctors and machines from IT support. So that's kind of highlighted where remote access can help, and I think that's been a major growth area there. But then I think there are also specific cases where remote access, like you hinted at, the speed with which you can support something is vital in the healthcare industry, and I think the kind of remote access solution has opened up use cases where you might monitor a device from somewhere quite far away, or maybe a different room in the hospital, or for a GP might be able to monitor their patients and the devices that the patients have from wherever in the world, basically. So it's kind of opened up that, and then there are other more futuristic use cases, like a conduit to allow gathering and processing of on-screen data into something like an AI model or things like that. So I think there's a lot of different use cases.
That actually helps. Now, in our first episode, you and I had a conversation around the differences between OEM and SDK implementations of remote access. And for those of you that are listening to this episode, I highly recommend, if you enjoy what you're hearing on this one and you want to get a little more detail on the differences, definitely go back and listen to the very first episode. Again, it talks about OEM versus SDK. But Dom, I'm wondering, in the case of healthcare, is one implementation better suited than the other for the healthcare industry?
So I was going to say probably not. A bit like last time around when we discussed this, I think a lot of it depends on the use case. It depends on the customer and their need for ownership of whatever they're doing. If they need to integrate into a solution in a particular way, if they want to make it their own solution, they don't want to see the RealVNC branding there. So those things influence it. But actually thinking about the healthcare industry, I think probably we've seen more OEM Connect type use cases, and actually a kind of third way, which is a hybrid of both. So there are some customers who have built out a solution that has It's an attempt to support devices that have VNC solutions already built into them. Maybe they're ours, maybe they're other people's, and they want to combine that with an SDK to kind of cover all bases in one pane of glass, that sort of use case. So, yeah, equivocating there, but it's kind of, it may be 50-50, maybe slightly more on the Connect side. Seems to make sense in this space.
Okay. That makes sense to me as well. Now, what I thought what we would do today is I want to use 3 different use cases that I found in talking to some folks on the back end of RealVNC, where remote access has been used. In some cases it's OEM, some cases it's SDK. And I thought that the 3 use cases would sort of paint a picture for the listening audience of how remote access could be used in healthcare, certainly how it is being used in healthcare, but then also maybe they can start going, oh, if they could do that there, maybe I could do that in my own implementation, so to speak. So they can see how remote access can be used to innovate customer solutions. So if it's okay with you, I'd like to kind of walk through a couple of different use cases. And I know in some instances we have company names, in some cases we don't, which always makes me laugh. I remember a comedian saying, well, I took this airline and I can't mention the name, but they fly south and they fly west. But anyways, and then he just went on with the joke. And we're obviously not going to do any of that, but we'll try to be as upfront about when we can with the customer names, and when we can't, we won't. But if it's all right, I'd like to walk through the 3 use cases, and I've got some questions I've written just so we can kind of talk about how they use remote access, what was the benefit to them, that sort of thing. Does that sound good?
It sounds awesome, yeah.
Okay, good. So the first one I have is Biotronic. And for those of you that don't know Biotronic, they specialize in cardiac rhythm management, vascular intervention, neuromodulation solutions. And they seem to me to be like a really good example, maybe even a great example of how RealVNC can be used to augment their solutions. So could you talk a little bit about how remote access technology actually supports, I'm thinking specifically around their cardiac monitoring solutions?
Yeah, definitely. They are a great use case. So, they build cardiac monitors, pacemakers, and those sorts of things. And you'll probably be glad to hear that the VNC solution isn't used actually on those devices. What it's used in is the devices that program those devices. So, a pacemaker doesn't really have a user interface.
You don't want to remote control into grandpa, is that what you're saying?
It's more about the kind of monitoring and support of the devices that are being used to program those things. So you can imagine that a doctor has requested that a patient has one of these things implanted in them, and they need to actually set up various parameters. There are loads of things that you can change about the way it works and the way it's reacting and gathering data from the patient. And they have these programmers that do that, and those programmers are effectively desktop computers. And as part of that, they decided, let's get a VNC server installed on those, because I think previously they were having to support these things by phone, having to kind of talk someone through on site what there is, or maybe they'd have to drive out to the customer site, the hospital likely, and do a 5-minute bit of diagnosis, 5-minute bit of fixing, and then back again an hour back to the office. So yeah, remote support there is really a kind of a game changer in terms of how quickly you can get these things done, because the issue here is you've got 3 parties basically. You've got Biotronic, who make these things and need to support them. You have the doctor or the technician who's installing and setting up the pacemaker or the cardiac device, and then you've got the patient. So all those things need to come together at the right time to figure out what's going on and to program in the right way if there's a problem. So it's a difficulty of scheduling, and that's just so much quicker if you can just dial in, look at the screen of the device, make some adjustments, get the right log files, get the right data that you need. No ambiguity there. So yeah, it's a big help to their kind of product support, product flow.
I can see some benefits here, like just speed of care. Obviously, instead of waiting for the person to drive the hour to then get there to do the thing, and then they have to drive. And there's also productivity benefits for the Biotronic folks, where they're not having to waste time. You mentioned, I think it was the truck wheels rolling and so on. Someone doesn't have to drive somewhere and drive back. Instead, they could focus on patient at different hospitals all over the country, so to speak. But are there other operational and patient care benefits? Like, I'm thinking sort of tangentially or maybe on the fringe is like accuracy because no one's rushed. I mean, yeah, that way they have time to do it. They just take the 5 minutes you said to look at the data, and they take the 5 minutes the whole time they need. No one's in a hurry. But are there other benefits that they've gained through remote access?
Yeah, I think that's dead right. So the technicians themselves are just going to be less tired, aren't they? They're going to be capable of immediately getting the data that they need and getting it first time. There's no repeat scheduling. I think one of the things that they've looked at and starting to do is that most of the time you're expecting the doctor or the technician to be able to operate this device themselves. And actually, one of the things that they do is training. That doesn't need to be necessarily on site anymore. It can be a remote training session. You can, with VNC, with our technology, you can do that in a kind of more targeted, shorter, focused manner. You don't need to do the whole massive training program. You can just say, wait a minute, why don't I just teach you how to do this in a short session? It can be much more focused on a particular feature or a particular use case. So I think there definitely are some big benefits there.
It also feels like, besides improved quality of care, better efficiency, that sort of thing, they're also then, and I'm not sure the folks that are listening to this podcast would care about this last one entirely because it's not their sphere of influence, but it feels like in at least a small way, there's an improved profitability in the delivery of care because it doesn't cost as much. The training can be done faster. You mentioned rescheduling. That's what got me thinking about it was, we don't have to reschedule that patient 3 times. And then therefore, obviously, if you reschedule a patient to come back because someone wasn't here over and over again, or even if it's just rescheduling them once, someone's time somewhere in a clinic, at a hospital, something had to be wasted. And that's just money wasted for that healthcare organization. So it feels like there's definitely some extra benefits.
Yeah, I mean, it's money wasted, and in these cases, it's potentially quality of life wasted as well. These people need the pacemakers or the cardiac devices to work as soon as possible, basically.
Yeah, so Grandpa actually doesn't mind if you remote control into his pacemaker. I'm just teasing, but yeah. So let's talk about the implementation. Was it complex? What did the process involve? Also, was this OEM or was this SDK? Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah. So I would say one thing about healthcare in general is that although the integration itself, the technical side of it might not be complex, there are a lot of things that surround that industry that do make things more complicated. So accreditation and verification and validation, those things can add to the time it takes. But effectively, Biotronic got in touch with us. They took evaluations of the various different products. They had a real good deep dive into Connect, and they had a deep dive into the SDK, and they settled it eventually on Connect as the best fit. And I think part of that is about that first step, that time to approval. If you can get a solution into the approval process early, then that whole thing is a lot easier. You've only got a certain number of months that you can actually push things into approval in some cases, and it's partly avoiding that dev requirement as well. So Connect worked for them. What we did was we worked with them for a number of months to build up a proof of concept that worked in conjunction with our support team and our online docs. So started by just using kind of scripting to run our off-the-shelf product in the right ways, get the right settings set up so that they could control users and how people accessed the devices and what they could and couldn't do. And then I think we eventually introduced them to some of our what we call Connect API access, which allows you to control the devices that you have in your Connect subscription and sort out exactly which devices are in which teams and things like that. So that was a kind of a gradual process of improvement over the period of a year or so. And they also were early adopters of OIDC integration, so single sign-on using Microsoft Entra and other solutions. So that really helped in terms of them being able to just take control of which users are allowed to access what, because we were federating that access to Entra. I'm not sure if it was Entra in their case, but it was one of those providers.
You can make it up. We'll believe you anyways.
Yeah. It could have been Entra, it could have been Okta, something like that.
I'm actually glad you mentioned that. We're going to talk about security later on, but I'm glad that's right there in the story so that those listening because obviously all of you listening are going to be worried about patient health information and protection of that, and then compliance mandates like GDPR and all the other, anything in the U.S. like CCPA and so on and so forth. And so we'll have a conversation about that, but I'm going to hold that thought back for myself. But I'm glad you mentioned that. Let's go to the second use case. This is the one that you mentioned about AI and patient data. Now, in this case, I know we can't name the customer, but I thought because AI is obviously working its way into every type of technology possible. We see a lot of it just becoming a way to speed up the process, make decisions, perform tasks, things like that. And I know that there's a customer that uses AI together with medical imaging in what probably would be considered kind of a revolutionary way. And you hinted at it a little bit when you were doing a bit of your intro about the ways that healthcare can use remote access. What can you tell us about their use case specifically?
Yeah. So it's all about healthcare data science, and effectively they've taken again the off-the-shelf product and integrate it into their product's workflow. So they kind of have a framework that they use to process clinical data, and that's from their partners, their customers, the hospitals, and they present it to data scientists and to machine learning models, and then it's used for kind of AI diagnosis, and the general output of what you get from ML in that case.
In more practical terms, are you talking about like it takes a screenshot of something it can see, and then a platinum an LLM looks at that and then makes a diagnosis based off of that screenshot, or is it something more than that?
I think it's more general than that, and Connect is kind of part of the whole use case. But yeah, effectively, you've got a conduit there for getting data out of desktops, whether that's on a device like a scanner, MRI scanner, or ultrasound, or whatever, or it could be other kinds of data that you've got that's more, numerical data. The good thing, I suppose, is if you use something like VNC to bring that in, it's always going to be in a common format. It's pixels basically, and the AI can work with that. But it's also more traditional. I think there's a more traditional part to this as well. So they build kind of access to the data through VMs, virtual desktops, and then they present that data to data scientists and to these machine learning models via those virtual sessions. So it's kind of two sides to the coin, I believe.
I think so. This was, I know, an OEM implementation, and hearing that it sounds like remote access is sort of a conduit. Do you think that was the most suitable choice, or if you just do, what was the reason why you think why OEM is the most suitable choice for this particular use case?
I think it was down to the time to market in this case, and I think the customer's dev availability, and I think they have actually very seriously looked at moving to an integrated SDK use case. But I think the great thing about not to diminish the off-the-shelf stuff, but the great thing about the SDK is that it's built for interfacing into things with a programmatic interface. So it's almost straight away right there for you to integrate it into a model, as a data input, rather than having to do some extra steps that you would have to do with an off-the-shelf bit of software. So I think, definitely it's something that they're looking at to create a kind of all-in-one integrated solution that would just be easier for customers, for their end users to make use of. So it's the next step, I think.
So what's interesting here about this one that seems a little different is like with the Biotronic use case, the remote access is used to access, I'm presuming, another workstation on the other end, which then controls the pacemaker and so on and so forth. There's the programming and that kind of thing. So there's no passing back and forth of any kind of patient data or anything that would be considered data that needs to be kept private. Versus this use case, it sounds like, even though my assumption of like a screenshot was wrong, but that's okay. So there's some data going back and forth. It is patient data of some kind because there's some analysis being done on the other side, as it were. Security comes into play here then specifically, again, just like it did with the Biotronic example here. What role does security play with remote access, in this use case?
Yeah, I think it's kind of part of, I guess you could call it the table stakes for this.
Hmm.
You need to have just the basics. You need to have AS128, AS256. You need to have things like certificate-based authentication. That's something they specifically needed.
Hmm.
The end user doesn't need to be concerned about this. It needs to be simple to use. It needs to be um, uh, proven secure. So something like certificate authentication, AES encryption from end to end, and again federated access for the users and user management via IDC. I think it's just vital that all that stuff is. Um, Without that, it's just not going to happen for these guys, and I don't think it would happen for any of those sorts of customers.
I've heard it
They
said
wouldn't get
once.
accreditation.
I've heard it said once, and the audience that's listening shouldn't read too much into this, but it was like the best security is the security that the user never knows about.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
in some ways, it sounds like when you talk about like certificate-based security and things like that for authentication, and that makes a lot of sense because there's just then the user simply opens something up, connects to
Yeah,
this, sends it there, whatever they're doing, and they don't know. But on the back
yeah,
end, everything is secure and been thinking about data security, compliance, and so on. Does
yeah.
that sound right to you?
It does. Yeah, yeah. And another thing that's kind of tangential to that is that in this use case, their customers are quite sensitive about where the data goes. So they actually build these kind of data models, the framework, and this whole infrastructure. They build it in such a way that they can deploy it out to the hospital or to the location where it's needed. So in that way, SDK and our Connect solution are great because we can do an on-prem thing where the data never goes out to our cloud, and it gives that extra level of security or reassurance to the end user that this data isn't going anywhere that you don't want it to.
Very good. And then do you see this kind of use of this implementation evolving either with this same customer or maybe even its use in other
Yeah,
customers?
yeah, 100%. I think we have seen this in other similar sort of data model machine learning interface use cases outside of healthcare, and I think it's it's great to have that kind of common interface to gather desktop data. Um, you don't really care what's on the screen. The AI doesn't really care what's on the screen. It's just a kind of common interface to a wide range of different things, and you can kind of imagine that you could do similar AI analysis with like UI automation, UI tasks, and people are trying to start doing that. And the SDK, in particular, because of the programmatic interface to get access to those raw pixels straight away in the API, gives you a kind of bolt-on ability to look at that data or to bring that data into a model from a lot of sources remotely, and then you could actually use it the other way too. So you've built the model, you can use VNC to do that control in reverse from a central location or a cloud service. So you can put into practice what the AI has learnt about maybe UI automation, maybe user support, even
Hmm.
um, those sorts of things. Business process automation. That's definitely a big growth area, and I think this is a tool for kind of democratizing access to that sort of data.
Okay. And you mentioned user support, and I think that actually ties to my third use case here, which is
Mm.
iClinics. And I'm going to say this for the audience listening. I think the story behind like what iClinics are using remote access for is pretty. It's simple enough. It's not benign. It has value, and we'll talk about that. But I think the way that they chose to implement it is sort of interesting, and that's why I want to talk about this one. But let's just talk about first off the iClinics, and I know you know which
Mm.
customer this is. Again, it's one of those ones we can't name. But what can you tell us about the use case and the problems that they were trying to solve by integrating remote access?
Yeah, so it's an iClinic use case, as you say, and it's surgical systems actually for cataract and retinal type surgery, and those are big machines. They have PCs again built into them, a bit like the Biotronic use case, but we're directly supporting or we're enabling direct support to those. So it's um, a kind of traditional use case in some ways. They've for embedded, they've got a device. They want it to have as little downtime as possible between patients. They want to be able to have their technicians remote in, not drive over, not talk on the phone to the optometrist. They want to get right there and see what's going on and support that.
And then was this a daily activity thing? Because you mentioned it's sort of not in having to do it over the phone. And I'm almost wondering if it's not even involving the optometrist period. It's behind the scenes. But is that the case? It's still an ongoing daily activity. And then also maybe just tie in, is there a security use case here as well?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think to answer the first question, I think it's pretty much a reducing downtime. So it is very much a continuous operation sort of thing. I think what they had was um, we we could use VNC, we could use the off-the-shelf, sorry, the open source VNC, and that works. Is it secure though? It's not secure, no. So we need to talk to someone like RealVNC and get a secure version of this. So that was kind of the fundamental reason for coming to us in the first place. And again, I think that this use case is a kind of, it's got that the IT support bit, and to do that, they built in an SDK based server into the device. The device itself, I think, was a kind of Windows embedded OS. But then they kind of have also opened up access to that device to their partners who offer support to these devices. So it's a kind of bring your own VNC viewer solution. So they can use either our off-the-shelf product viewer to connect in, or they can use a customized SDK-based viewer as well in a kind of single pane of glass to support these things. So it's got a kind of a hybrid approach that they took.
And that's what I actually found interesting about this use case was they chose an SDK implementation. I think you answered the question already, which is because they open it up to multiple vendors to be able to use as opposed to having a fixed client. So is that the reason why they chose an SDK implementation, was to open it up so everyone could take advantage of it on the other vendors?
Yeah, I think so. It's partly they wanted to own it. They wanted it to be their thing on the device. But the other side, they don't care quite so much about. They can, make use of. They can have their customer support people use an iPhone or an iOS tablet, iPad, or whatever device. It doesn't need to be something they own. It can be something that the customer's just got our viewer and is running with it.
Let's talk about implementing really quick here. So for whether it's a healthcare equipment manufacturer, maybe it's a healthcare organization themselves, and they're interested in integrating remote access, where should they start?
I'm going to roughly repeat what I said in our last conversation, but I think they should talk to us. That's the starting point. I think they need to look at our healthcare case studies, white papers. So that's they should be very relevant to whatever they're trying to do, and they need to think about the use case. They need to think about whether they want to take ownership of a solution. They want it to be theirs. They want to be able to push it out onto devices and kind of make it very seamless, streamlined to all, or whether they're happy to use something that's more bring your own sort of thing. What customization they need, how locked down does it need to be, and whether they have a dev team and time to build that. And I think then to take a trial of whatever of the two key solutions makes sense. So whether that be Connect or the SDK, and then to run a POC of that in their environment with our help. It should be a fairly straightforward process to get going.
And then are there any common challenges for healthcare providers that they face when implementing? So is there maybe thinking about starting down this path?
Yeah.
Some things that you'd say, well, you might have thought about things like dev teams and having internal resources and so on, but here's a couple of the common things that you should be looking for. And then maybe any just brief bits about how they might overcome those challenges.
Yeah. It kind of goes back to the regulatory stuff. That's the most common hurdle that I've seen in the healthcare world. And I think that's a case of early on looking at what are your schedules for getting your product into the regulatory process? Can you get to the point at which you've got our stuff integrated into your solution before that point? And it's also a case of looking at whichever solution you choose, whether it's ours or one of our competitors. You're looking at the kind of almost a tick box of what does HIPAA require, what do all these different regulations require, and looking at can I support those things with this solution? Can I implement an idle timeout? Can I do MFA in the way I need to? Can I do role-based access? Can I lock down file transfer, like I mentioned before. The other thing is, and I kind of touched on it with the security aspect, is that because these solutions will be used in these kind of often busy and chaotic situations. I'm not besmirching hospitals in any way, but they are often they're pushed for time, they're pushed for patients' time, they're pushed for they're stressed. You need to make sure the user onboarding and the user training is right, and we can help with that. We can help guide their teams through how you would train people in the use of the software. And that's vital for any environment where people are not primarily IT support. They're not necessarily used to these tools. So I think that's a big thing that can be a challenge.
Excellent. Now, we've talked about security in all three use cases. Sometimes you mentioned it before I ever asked. Sometimes I asked, but in all cases, security kind of plays a role, and we know that it obviously has to. It's critical in healthcare. So for those that are listening today, and maybe let's do it this way: in your best vendor-neutral voice. Let's put it that way, right? So really, just trying to help out those that are listening, as opposed to like talking about how RealVNC slices and dices, makes julienne fries, and all the other features that it has around security. In your best vendor-neutral voice, what should those that are listening look for in a remote access provider so they can make sure they ensure patient privacy, data is protected? We talked about authentication. I mean, all those kinds of things. What would be the list that you'd say it definitely should have these 5 things, or whatever number you'd like?
Yeah, I think probably the top one for me, and this is a little bit vendor biased, is track record. So I think that healthcare in particular has a problem with remote access in terms of a lot of places have been using lots of different sources of remote access to do lots of things in a kind of hurried fashion, especially since COVID. And some of those solutions that they have are maybe not so secure, not ideal. They're whatever you've already got in the system, basically. So that's a problem, and I think a lot of hospitals and healthcare providers are concerned about that. But I think that bringing that all into one solution that's deployed thoughtfully, carefully, and is secure by default, secure by design, that's your first point. It's kind of track record. Look at who you're buying from. How many data breaches have they had in their own systems? How many vulnerabilities have they potentially had? Then the sort of basic actual technical side of things is you need the basic encryption that we talked about before. That's AES-128, AES-256, and whatever comes next as well. Maybe you want to use a solution that doesn't trust the environment in which it's running. It's end-to-end encrypted. Maybe it's got perfect forward secrecy, so even if someone were to record that session, they couldn't then decrypt it later. There's no mathematically possible way to decrypt that, even if you end up with the keys. So that's something that we have. Again, I think you need to look at the user permissions and how much you're locking down access limits for different users, because in this sort of setting, you're not necessarily doing an IT support use case. You might be bringing doctors to their patients. You might be bringing doctors to their devices, or to other people, or nurses, to all these different locations, and they're not IT professionals. They don't necessarily have the training in that. They will be getting some, I'm sure, but it's not quite the same use case. So you need to be looking at what devices can access what other devices, and remote access is a key part of that. So lockdown access, lockdown user permissions, the authentication for each user. Again, it's going to have to be multi-factor, prompted potentially in some cases. So you have an end user who's saying, I allow this session to happen, and federated ideally. So going back to what we talked about before about single sign-on, Entra, Okta, those sorts of things. So you don't need to recreate a whole new set of users in this environment. You already know who your users are. You can federate that with us. And then I think the bit that that kind of is very specific to healthcare is the regulatory stuff. So it's HIPAA and the other accreditations that you mentioned. And I think what we do, at least, it's getting a bit vendor specific here, is we provide the tools, and I think you need to make sure that whoever you are buying from provides the tools to be compliant with those things. No patient health info is directly transferred to you. Maybe you need to make sure that, again, that the connection is authorized connection, and there's repudiation for that. You can time out idle sessions. You can lock down things like file transfer. And yeah, I think we provide all the tools for that. And then, yeah, going back to the track record, you want people who are kind of open to outside auditing, like we have been with the Cura 53 white box audit and that kind of ongoing commitment to security. So I think that's probably more than 5 things, but five headline items.
Thank you for these 73 things.
Yeah.
You probably named 6. I wasn't even counting. So I love that you actually started with the track record. I think that's important because we forget about supply chain attack. And the idea is we just don't think about every type of solution we're using that technically is part of the supply chain. If I'm a healthcare organization, any other technology provider is part of my supply chain. If they're not secure, then I should be worried and be concerned about, so I think that's a great place to start. Awesome, Dom. Thank you very much for the good conversation today. Appreciate you coming today.
Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, well, that's all the time we do have for today. We have been talking with Dom Parks, lead developer for OEM at RealVNC. If you'd like to get more information on RealVNC and their OEM program, you can visit realvnc.com/OEM. And remember, this is the second episode in a 6-part series, so be on the lookout for all of the podcast episodes in this series on your choice of podcast platform. Thanks a lot for listening. We'll catch you all in the next one.